So we have a single die simulation. And then we have, all the bits and pieces that go along with that. And then the sampling distribution part of it. You can see some pretty heavy duty stuff here. I think the best way to handle it would be to, I don't want to do a split. I'll just go back and forth. It's fine. All right. So get a Google Sheet open here. Cool. Sheets. Blank. All right, so I have an untitled spreadsheet. You call it something helpful, I suppose. I'll just say CLT can. All right. And then once you title it, create your share permissions. So you want to go to general access, anyone with a link, change it from viewer to editor. All right. So these are the settings that I'd like you to have. All right. And, if you don't have those settings, I'll kick it back to you and you can make the change, but, do it early on and you don't have to worry about it. All right. So right to the top here, sign in, blah, 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 like all that stuff. You don't have to worry about naming it in a particular way because it's all going into the form. This is kind of an old version. So what I want you to do is rand between 500 times. So you start off in column A, cell 1. So equals rand between 1 and 6. But I want you to do that 500 times. So you do it the one time. I mean, if you had to type it in 500 times, it'd be a nightmare, but you don't. So that's good. All right. So what we can do then is just click on the cell and drag that little boxy thing in the corner down and down and down over and over again, all the way down to 500. It takes a second, but it shouldn't be that bad. See, I'm already halfway there. Once we do this, we're going to create a graph. But I'm going to say, notice how we're already like 400 cells down. If you create the graph right now, you're going to have a graph that's about 400 cells down below the top of the page. And, it's not the end of the world, but I might not see the graph. All right. And so, because I generally don't think to scroll down 500 cells in order to find a graph. So, scroll back up, click in a cell somewhere in this area here, and then create your graph. All right. So we have our randomization. We want to do a frequency histogram. All right. And then, we'll come up with other, metrics in a couple minutes, but we want to have a frequency histogram containing all that data. All right. So I'm going to go in to insert chart. All right. It says no data, but I can change that. I mean, just go into data range here and type in A1 colon A500. You could also highlight the data first and then select insert chart. That's up to you. It brings back this mess, which is not at all what I want. So you go into chart type and go on down to the one that says it's in the other section. Go to the one that says histogram chart. And now we have at least the makings of an appropriate graph. It's just my numerical scales here aren't very nice. So under customize, you go down the list here, chart style if you want to get crazy with the colors, histogram, a very important bucket size. They have it set to auto. I want it set to a particular value because this is a simulation of rolling a die 500 times. The outcomes are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Just because they have all these other decimals here doesn't mean I have to live with that. So I'm going to change my bucket size to 1. So this would be my outcome of 1s. Now, technically, it's, if you think back to histograms, when we talked about that earlier in the course, this is 1 to less than 2. So 1. 2 to less than 3. So that would be 2. And you could estimate the sizes here, but you could also adjust the grid lines and ticks and things like that in order to come up with the values too. But regardless, I mean, at least you have a sense of the shape, so that anytime the graph, the random values change, and they will, it'll create a corresponding fluctuation in your histogram. All right. But anyway, I clicked on some things out of order here. So we were in histogram. We took care of that. If you want item dividers, you can do that. I don't see the need for that, but it looks kind of funky. Chart, axis, and title. You don't have to title the graph, but you should, you must label the axes appropriately. All right. So horizontal axis title, you could call it roll of a die. Really anything that gets that idea across. All right. I mean, I used to just write die, but that kind of felt a little morbid. So roll of a die, outcomes for the roll of a die, whatever you can think of. Anything related to that. Vertical axis title should be frequency. All right, and it'll automatically update. I mean, again, you can play around with colors and things like that. I don't really need anything special there, but that's optional on your end. Series, again, the series should be related to the data that's selected. Data series 1, how do you want it filled? This is when the series tab is important if you have multiple data sets on the same set of axes, so that you could distinguish one from another. Since this is just a one data set, we're not really worried about that. Legend, right? How you want the legend, if you had a key for the graph, where you want to position things like that, not relevant here. Horizontal axis, if you wanted to customize your intervals here, like for example, I'm going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, and then all of a sudden to 6.5. So if I wanted to, and I do, I would make that a 7 just to keep my intervals consistent. Now, again, you might say, well, there's no way you could roll a 7 when you roll a die, but this interval is from 1 to less than 2, then 2 to less than 3, 3 to less than 4, 4 to less than 5, 5 to less than 6, 6 to less than 7. So it'll never actually get to a 7, even though it's listed here as a max. Vertical axis, I mean, if you want to change your labels to be slanted and things like that, that's fine. Vertical axis, same idea. If you wanted to customize the mins and maxes, but more particularly the maxes, you'd only do that if your bars were going off the grid. All right, so not a concern here. So I can just get out of there. Grid lines and ticks. All right, that's what I was saying before in terms of creating little benchmarks along the way to help you count values, but really it's more about the shape than anything else. But I could put major and minor tick marks in, and then customize that. All right, the line thickness and things of that nature here. So if I want to do the outside, just to have a little extra, a little extra sense of scale, not necessary. You can opt out of that if you like, but just figured I'd show you that part of things. All right, but this would be our histogram for a single roll of a die 500 times. Now, if you notice, I'm just going to type in something here. The shape of my graph changes. It's fluctuating because my random values are fluctuating. But now I have something that I could use kind of as a simulator to show what the different outcomes for 500 rolls of a die would look like graphically. right? And as long as it's relatively uniform, right, it's not going to be perfectly uniform. If I roll a die 500 times, it's conceivable that I could have 200 ones, 52s. You know, it's conceivable. It's not likely, but it should be in the neighborhood of uniformity, right? So that's the first part of things. That's really what all of this stuff right up until number 7 is getting to. So that part should be good now. But then in C1 and C2, so I'm very, very particular about where I want you to put this stuff, only because all the references later on work. They only work if you put the initial values in the right place. So in C1 and C2, you type in mean and standard deviation. So C1, mean, and if you got to move the graph somewhere else, you can. Mean, standard deviation. And then we actually find the mean and standard deviation, right? So these would be, you just copy and paste it right in if you want. Average A1 to A500, standard deviation A1 to A500, all right? So equals average A1 to A500. And it'll ask you if you want to autofill, which sometimes is helpful. It hardly ever is, though, because we want to make some changes here. We want to actually talk about the standard deviation now. So equals, anytime you do a math command in Sheets, you got to make sure you have an equals sign in first, any kind of function. You see the different options here. Standard deviation of a sample. If any values of text, if there are any text values in there, they're treated as 0, which we would probably never want. Entire population, and then back to sample. So we'll just go with the simple standard deviation. And again, A1 to A500. All right, so I know the mean and standard deviation for this set of data. And again, if I make some changes, those numbers change, but they're always in the same neighborhood. Right? No matter what I do, you're living in the 3.5 and the 1.7, 1.8 interval. All right. And that's how it should be. All right. So then we're going to create, starting in column F1, we're going to create 10 different samples, all of size 10. All right. So we're going to sample from this group of 500 values. This is a fairly complicated code, but I mean, we could use a VLOOKUP, but this is just as good. It's going to index a value in the interval of A1 to A500 based off of a rand between. All right. So like I said, I'm going to type in a sample 1 here. All right. Your graph doesn't really have to be prominent. You can just make it a little small graph in here. That's one of the reasons why editing permissions are important, because if you make your graph super tiny to get it out of the way, and then you leave it like that and submit it, I'd like to be able to go in and resize your graph and have a better look at it. All right. So indexing a value based off a rand between. So what this is doing is it's taking a random number between 1 and 500 and matching that up with the row reference number. So here from 1 to 2 to 3, all the way down to 500. So let's say this rand between comes up with 10. It's going to go to row 10 and pull back that number. All right. So that's precisely what we need. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 total values. I've now just created a random sample from a random sample containing 10 values. All right. So I need to copy and paste that to well, I did F3 to F11, but I'm also going to need to replicate that. You can see in the, going down to 13, I'm going to have to replicate that a bunch of times. But before we do that, we're going to put in mean of sample in E12. All right. So E12, this is the mean of the sample. We're also going to need the standard deviation of the sample. All right. We'll get to the commands in a second, but well, actually, sorry, I was thinking of something else. No, you won't need that. We'll get to more standard deviation stuff in a second, but you use the average command here if you want, or you just type it in. All right, I'll type it in. So equals average. And it's convenient enough. I could just highlight the column of information here, close up the parens, and type it in. So this is my mean of the sample. What I want to do now is take all of this and copy it over so that there's a total of 10. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I want to go all the way out to O. So highlight the stuff that you want to replicate. Drag your cursor down to that little boxy thing in the corner. Your mouse head will turn into a little crosshair, and then just drag on over. And not only does it replicate the information, it'll also adjust the commands accordingly. So my average G2 to G11, H2 to H11, and so on. It also increments up your sample value. So I called it sample 1. It knew that I probably wanted to call this sample 2, 3, 4. So it incremented that for us also, which is really nice. All right. So now I have that. And, I mentioned a lot of Control C, Control V, Command C, Command V, but really that little boxy thing in the corner after you highlight, that's really where the magic happens. All right. So in E13, we want the mean of the sample means. All right. And in E14, we want the standard deviation of the sample means. All right. So that's kind of a mouthful. All right. So E13, the mean of the sample means. All right. So these are my sample means right here. I'll just highlight those real quick. And that's going to create what's known as a sampling distribution. More on that next class. But what we're finding here is the mean of these means. Each one of these, and I know I'm saying means a lot, but it's kind of the only way to do it. This is a mean of this sample. This is a mean of this sample. So, and so on. So each one of these serves as a mean of a sample. I want to find the mean of all of these means, the mean of the means. So equals average, and I want all this, F to O. So my mean of the sample means about 3.46. That'll change. But if you look, hint, hint, based off the answers that you're gonna have to provide in the Google form, look at the relationship between the mean of the overall distribution of data, all those 500 values. The mean was about 3.468. The mean of my sample means also gives me something in the neighborhood of 4.6. And if I change something, the values change. It's not always going to be there, but we can start thinking about the percent of times in which the mean of the sample means is equal to the population mean, right? Or the pseudo population mean. So the next one would be the standard deviation of the sample means. I got a little update request, but I don't need it. I'm just sliding things over to make it fit. Standard deviation of the sample means, so equals STDEV, and then just run on over, close it up, and hit enter. All right, and so this gives us the standard deviation of all of these sample means And I can tell you that there is a relationship between this number, and that's the heart of what's known as the central limit theorem. And I'm going to highlight those in green. So there's a relationship between these two numbers, and there's a relationship, I'll go nice little blue there, between these two numbers. All right. And that's one of the things that we'll have to figure out as we go. All right. So everything else after that is a question related to this. Although, yeah, I definitely need to do some editing, because this is the series of questions that the way they used to be. So you don't have to answer all of these questions, just the ones that are in the form, right? In the Google form. If I go back to the assignment itself, you have the Google form here. You click on that. These are the questions. There's just really 3 questions that I want you to answer. All right. So you'll put your link to the spreadsheet. We just created it. All right. This is all you have to do for the spreadsheet. Now, once you do that, maybe you move your graph around somewhere so it's visible but not in the way. Something like that would be fine. It's automatically saving. You get your share link. If you don't already have it, make sure it's anyone with the link editor. Copy that link. That goes into the form, all right, along with your name and your answers to these 3 questions. All right. So these 2, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. This one, a little bit more thought-provoking. But again, if you give a thoughtful answer for this, you get full credit. All right. So anything, it's really more about your observations than anything else. All right.